Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by Professor Courtney Thorsson, Associate Professor in the English Department at the University of Oregon. She's the author of Women's Work, Nationalism and Contemporary African-American Women's Novels. And Professor Thorsson joins us today to talk about her new book, The Sisterhood, How a Network of Black Women Writers Changed American Culture. Of The Sisterhood, our friend and mentor for many, Farah Jasmine Griffin writes, starting with a photograph, Courtney Thorsson brings her all to this luminous work about sisterhood, a group of Black women writers who met informally in the 1970s. Together, they transformed American literature and helped to shape generations of writers, visual artists, filmmakers, and scholars. This is a profoundly important story, and it has found an astute and sensitive author in Thorsson. How are you doing today, Professor Thorsson?
I'm doing well. So happy to be here.
So this book starts with a photograph. If you could narrate for us your relationship to this photograph and how this photograph leads to this wonderful new book.
Thank you. Sure. So in 2004, it was the great beloved friend and mentor, Farah Griffin, who said, "Oh, Courtney, there's this photo you just have to see," in Evelyn White's then brand new biography of Alice Walker. And it was the photo of this group, the Sisterhood. So right away, I recognized Walker, Morrison. Well, in 2004, I recognized June Jordan. I had no idea yet about Verna Mae Grosvenor, some of the other women in the picture who I'd come to learn about. But I just kind of let it post-it note on that page. I would occasionally open it if I needed inspiration. If I saw anything I thought might be related to it, I'd, stick it in a folder of notes. And then the amazing Black feminist scholar, institution builder, mentor, the late, great Cheryl Wall in 2009 knew that this project on the sisterhood was bubbling in the back of my mind. And she was doing research in June Jordan's papers at Harvard and found some meeting minutes titled The Sisterhood. 1977, there's an agenda and minutes. So Cheryl passed those on to me, and that confirmed all my suspicions. This was a much more formal and organized group. This is not a one-off get-together in February 1977. This was a structured, collaborative group of Black women writers. And the research journey began from there. And here we are, however many years later, through visits in many archives and interviews and so on, that I've been able to piece together or knit together the story of what these women did.
So what was happening in the culture? And by that, I mean the lives of Black women writers, what's happening in terms of Black literature, what is happening in this moment of February of 1977 that necessitated this gathering of women who, as you write in the book, would gather roughly for about 2 years, no more than a dozen times. What was happening in the culture that drew them together in this moment?
I'll say a big picture thing and a smaller picture thing.
Mm-hmm.
So the big picture is by 1977, we're over a decade past the last major civil rights legislation. Black power, it's waning. We know that the kind of legislative channels have not produced Black freedom and liberation in the way that activists had hoped. And so it made perfect sense for these women to turn their attention to culture, meaning magazines, mass magazines, trade publications, eventually the academy. So that was a logical place for them to put their power because kind of legislative channels had failed. This was also a time when there was not necessarily a single charismatic leader or one kind of political movement organizing Black radical thought by the late 70s, but it was still right before the Reagan era would totally foreclose some of that radical imagination and freedom dreaming of the late 60s and early 70s. So that's kind of like, it makes sense they would think about books, magazines, classrooms as places where they could do stuff. in the immediate, when they met in February 77, this was immediately following. In 1976, Ntozake Shange's For Colored Girls is on Broadway. She wins an Obie Award in 76. Multiple members of the group told me that Shange's face was plastered on the poster for Colored Girls all over New York City. So the kind of virulent backlash against Black women that seems to happen every time there is a varied and beautiful and very public depiction of Black women, as in For Colored Girls, was targeted right at Shange. So the need for that kind of safe all Black woman space was especially urgent. And Shange was hyper visible because of those posters. And people told, Margo Jefferson said, we were all dazzled when Ntozake Shange would come to town, because Shange was she was the star in that moment, right?
The two figures who helped bring this together are June Jordan and Alice Walker. Jordan, primarily known at the time for her poetry and maybe some of her nonfiction essays. Alice Walker, of course, was a poet and a novelist of some distinction. Meridian had just been published when this gathering occurs. And of course, The Color Purple is still a few years away. What was the nature of the relationship of June Jordan and Alice Walker, in this moment?
Close, political, radical, and accommodating of conflict and dissent. So that's, it's an important literary friendship. The poet Patricia Spears Jones used the phrase, June was the catalyst, meaning June Jordan was really good at getting her friends to do stuff when she saw the need for political change.
She was an organizer.
She was an organizer. An organizer of the boycott of American Poetry Review, an organizer eventually of the open letter to the New York Times protesting the fact that Toni Morrison had not won a National Book Award. So Jordan was an organizer of many things, but to the tenor of and sort of shape of Walker and Jordan's friendship, they had a long and loving written correspondence, and they had met. I'm almost certain it's that Margaret Walker introduces them in Mississippi, possibly even at the Phyllis Wheatley Poetry Festival, which I just attended, the 50th anniversary commemoration of, organized by Ebony Lumumba. So in 73 at the Wheatley Poetry Festival, if it's not the first time they've met, it's the moment that Jordan and Walker really solidify the friendship. They start writing these regular letters where they're working out stuff about their writing, about their romantic lives, their personal lives, so on. And they were comrades. They had a shared vision for the centrality of Black women's writing in the liberation of, they just both sort of agreed from jump that literature is an essential tool of liberation. So all of this kind of organizing together, or that was a kind of grows from that shared value of literature as a tool for liberation.
They're not the only Black women organization or Black women coming together as an organization at that period of time, right? Combahee Collective is also meeting at this point in time, right? As early as 1974, as you note in the book. What's happening different with the Sisterhood than what we might have seen with Combahee? And why do we so easily recall Combahee now? In ways that as folks are reading the pages of their book, right, they're going to be really first introduced to the idea of the Sisterhood.
So let me say, this late 70s, mid to late 70s period, there is a broad network of Black feminist kind of cultural organizing going on in all different locations. So somebody else should write a book like this about Atlanta and about Boston and about Chicago, right? There are other archives and other stories to be written. And I also highly recommend to people Kimberly Springer's book, Living for the Revolution, to get a sense of that landscape of Black feminist organizations in the period. So Beverly and Barbara Smith, sisters, and Demita Frazier in Boston co-founded the Combahee River Collective in 73, 74. Combahee, of course, breaks off from the National Black Feminist Organization partly in reaction to homophobia in that organization in 73. Combahee is working in Boston 73, 74, really focused on community action, direct political organizing, like a battered women's shelter, the murdered Black women in Boston, pushing police attention toward that, food accessibility, kind of basic needs type work. And then, and it's actually on the margins of our professional organization, the Modern Language Association, that Barbara Smith and Audre Lorde are using the fact that work is already paying them to go to MLA. They're like meeting in a side room and planning Black lesbian retreats. It's very central for Combahee. But the turn in 76, so with the Combahee River Collective statement, 76, 77, the statement marks a turn toward a focus on study and writing. And that has to do with the fact that Barbara Smith and others are moving into academic circles. So like lots of other Black feminist thinkers, the labor eventually moves into the academy, partly under the idea that academic institutions might be able to sustain the effects of that labor over the longer term. But there was, I think, difference in dissent in Combahee about whether reading, writing, and teaching books was the path, right? Was the place to use the capital. The Sisterhood kind of started from the beginning with the idea that reading, writing, teaching, getting Black women's works published, publicized, and recognized was unquestionably valuable political work. So that's one difference there. Why do we remember Combahee? I mean, this is not original to me. I think, Farrah Griffin is among the people who've made this point. They were good writers, and we have a statement that we can print and reprint. I mean, I just taught it again in my Black feminist lit class, and they use it's this. I mean, and it has to do with how we get to know Jordan as an organizer too, or how we know Ida B. Wells as a crusader, against lynching, an organizer in the late 19th century, right? Knowing how to deploy structure, metaphor, description, there's all that writing. I mean, the skill at writing is part of what makes our knowledge possible and makes the historical record persist.
Talk about the makeup of the organization for a moment. There's a quote that you mentioned from Renita Weems, who was part of the organization, religious figure in terms of her scholarship. And she talks about the name brand people, right, in the group, right? And of course, that's clearly a shot to Shange, to Morrison, to Walker, right? Folks who are generally recognized in this moment as stars, right? But it wasn't just about the stars, right? It was about all of these other women who were in the group, many of them who were also working day jobs,
Correct.
Right? Writing for various publications and magazines. Morrison's still an editor, Correct. Right? I mean, that's a huge part of her impact in this moment. So talk about the makeup of the organization.
So they vary in age by at least 30 years. You have writers, editors like Morrison, Song of Solomon comes out while the Sisterhood is meeting, and that's kind of the book she sees as her turning point, right, from editor to novelist, even though it's really another 10 years until she fully leaves Random House. You have these other stars, but then you also have, yes, Reverend Dr. Renita Weems and Rosemary Bray, who is also a womanist theologian out of this group. Now, they had both just graduated from college and moved to the city, taken some of the first courses in Black women writers taught by Hortense Spillers at Brandeis, among other things. That was, I think, Wilson took that one at Brandeis. So just kind of figuring out, what does it mean to be in New York? I mean, Patricia Spears Jones told me she didn't even know if she was a writer yet. And she was, so you have those younger groups. You have some of the more senior members of the group include Paule Marshall, who had helped found Harlem Writers Guild, right? So she had other experiences with literary collectives, but also Paule Marshall knew how to do things like blurb someone's novel or deal with an agent. So she brought that kind of institutional knowledge in a mentorship role as well. Now, Judith Wilson, who would go on to become one of our most important art historians, in my view, who I like to talk about Judith Wilson as the person who understood the importance of Lorraine O'Grady almost 50 years before the rest of us got to see a retrospective of Lorraine O'Grady's work. I mean, Judith Wilson has many achievements, but that helps contextualize her. Now, Judith Wilson had just graduated from college where she had learned note-hand, which is a version of shorthand that they taught all women college students, particularly Black women, under the assumption you would do some kind of secretarial work. So when Judith Wilson comes to the Sisterhood, she's young, she's figuring out New York, and she knows note-hand, which is how she becomes the secretary for the group. And that's her word, secretary. So it was an anti-hierarchical group, and also not all things are equal, right? There's different skill sets, ages, career stages, and economic backgrounds. We know from Margo Jefferson's Negroland, first memoir, Negroland, we know a great deal about Margo Jefferson's comfortable class background and her own navigation of that from that stunning, formally experimental memoir.
Right.
And you might imagine how someone like Patricia Spears Jones, who would self-describe as from a poor family in Arkansas, those two class backgrounds are intersecting, right? So differences of class, age, career, geography, so on. And they took turns hosting meetings, but not everyone had an apartment big enough to host a meeting.
Right, or nice enough, right?
Right. So like the lawyer, the lawyer Sheila Rush had the Upper West Side Classic 6, and she hosted quite a few meetings. She had a lot of space, whereas to other members were like, I don't even think I have 3 chairs, much less 15 or 30, right?
I was fascinated at the fact that they in fact kept minutes. They took dues, right? So you get a sense that this wasn't just an informal thing, right? They saw this very much as kind of a formal gathering, formal institution. And while the need to take notes might have been just for the business of the organization, it also seems they were cognizant that they needed to document this history in a way that Black women's history and impact on other Black cultural institutions had largely been erased.
100%. So in working on this book, I thought often of, there's a story that the modernist scholar Jeremy Braddock tells when the Beinecke went around and started collecting all the Harlem Renaissance writers' stuff. And there's a letter from Anne Spencer to Langston Hughes that says, I didn't know all the men were saving their letters. Wow. And Anne Spencer was not hanging on to copies of her letters and drafts, right?
Right. That's deep.
Yeah. This generation of women, the women of the Sisterhood, and this particular late 70s and early 80s Black women writers and intellectuals, they understood the importance of their work. Alice Walker saved everything from jump. She has her journals from, her youth, from her childhood, her first writings. She saved the tiny little cassette tapes in her answering machine in the 80s in her apartment with voicemails from many of these women. And Walker has a whole organization system that Emory adopted whole cloth when they acquired her archive. So first, my project never would have been possible without these women valuing and understanding the value of their archive. Now, but as to their monthly meetings of the Sisterhood, they understood that the group was important from the moment it was happening. They understood there was a lot of capital in the room. So when you talk about those minutes and the agendas and the dues and the Rolodex, and they refer to their library and so on, they called themselves the Sisterhood at the first meeting, and they always capitalized it. Always the Sisterhood, capitalized in all correspondence, minute meetings, and agendas. Yes, these agendas and minutes, I think they definitely knew that scholars like me were going to look at these one day. There's a few things about that. First, there's a record of who attended, at the top. with all those minutes. And second, there are things that they chose to leave out. Not everything is for everybody. So I know from interviews I conducted for the book, and I have permission to say that women brought their kids to the meetings, and people would look after their children. There is not nary a mention of childcare or children in any agenda or meeting minutes, because the sisterhood was about their work. It was about, and their public facing work. They had one of the least known women in the photo, who at the time went by Nana Maynard, who's down in the corner, in the left side corner of the photo, who now goes by Dr. Sananda Ananda Maynard, who is a practitioner and teacher of transcendental meditation. And she was already in the beginnings of that path by the time the sisterhood met, and Walker was studying transcendental meditation. Now, look, you might see in meeting minutes, the group then discussed meditation.
Right.
Period. Marsha Ann Gillespie came to a meeting to discuss depression with the sisterhood. Period.
Okay.
Right. But if Ntozake Shange is going to get cassette tapes of dance performances in the Bay Area, then there's a list of names and groups and what we think about the West Coast performances and VHS and this and that. Right. But all the other stuff is either not the sort of interpersonal, private stuff. They clearly made a choice not to put that material in the minutes.
Let me ask you this question, right? I'm gonna ask you to do a little Afrofuturist imagining with the sisterhood. Would this have worked 40 years later, 45 years later, of a gathering of women coming on Zoom? How much of the importance of these gatherings was literally the physical proximity that they would have to each other, to see each other face to face, to be able to touch each other, to be able to impact each other in the moment?
Well, the phrase Toni Cade Bambara used was a community of writers, even if they only slap five once a month. And that slapping five, there's something real to that.
Yeah.
I think that connecting virtually can be sustaining and meaningful in some ways. And I also think physical proximity is important. Veve Clark was teaching at Berkeley at the time the sisterhood was meeting, and she would fly back to New York once a month to attend meetings of the sisterhood. So, and I say this also as a person, as I say, when I've just having come, and we are almost 45 years later, we're 40 years later from this group, just having come from the 50th anniversary of Phyllis Wheatley Poetry Festival, as you may have even heard by now, after Alice Walker offered her remarks, and people were kind of shouting about how there should be a playlist of songs that she had mentioned. Someone put on Al Green's Love and Happiness, and the entire room of hundreds of people got up, started dancing, and did the electric slide.
Yes.
That filled me up for a long time, Mark. That, and you can't do that over Zoom.
Right. You mentioned Toni Cade Bambara, and then this earlier moment when thinking about the sisterhood and Black women writers in college campuses and universities, right? Before we think about formalized Black studies and women and gender studies departments, Toni Cade Bambara had a foothold at an organization called SEEK, New York City college system, an opportunity for first generation, low income Black and brown students. Talk a little bit about how significant SEEK was and the way that women like Toni Cade Bambara utilize this platform to be able not only to further their career, but really to introduce and reintroduce Black literature to wider audiences.
So SEEK was such an important first teaching job of college students for so many women in the sisterhood and their generation. Jessica Harris, the culinary writer, sisterhood member, she taught in SEEK. Adrienne Rich, who is among the most important white women allies of women in this group, and Sikh, Bambara, Jordan, and I mean, many others, so on.
Nellie McKay took Sikh courses, right?
Yes, exactly. And so that part is, I couldn't even piece together the whole, one of the things I say in the book is that I think that these women's teaching may have been the site of their greatest impact, and it's also the hardest one to record. I mean, of course, on Nellie McKay, everybody needs to read Shana Benjamin's Half in Shadow, fantastic book about Nellie McKay, really, I think, a model for Black feminist life writing. But we can't even know who all they taught across city college locations in the Sikh program. Now, that said, two things. Bambara for sure, and I think other of these women as well. Sikh was new in the mid to late 60s.
Yeah.
It was an experiment, and so it was a site of pedagogical experimentation. And so, Bambara is the kind of teacher who you could easily imagine starts off by asking every student to talk about how they're feeling that day, which I could never imagine, right? I would, that's not my way at all. But you think about her push and her experimentation in the classroom, but also they were swapping syllabi all the time, and they were commuting together. So, Morrison and Bambara would sometimes drive together. Shange was taking the train, and sometimes Walker would be on it. And sometimes David Bradley, whatever he was doing in New York, would also see them on the train. And so actually just the moving back and forth, and Morrison was working on Sula and later Song of Solomon in the station wagon on the yellow legal pad while stopped in traffic driving to teach with others of the Sikh women in the car. So there's the idea that there's no way to do it but together. You should experiment. You have the lived experience and the knowledge expertise to create something good and new for Black and brown students in New York. And kind of just brave trying and flying by the seat of their pants a little bit, I think, was part of it too.
Speaking of institutions, I mean, one of the part of the labor that the Sisterhood does is to make sure that writers are getting reviewed, besides publish, right? The publishing is the first part of it, but the other part of it is, where do they get reviewed? And there were not a lot of journals, magazines, organs that were open to Black women writers. Ms. Magazine might have been one example of that, but as you write in the book, when For Color Girls was first circulating, they weren't interested in publishing a review about it, right? It wasn't until it blew up. Right. One of the magazines I think that becomes significant, and you attest to this in the book, is Essence Magazine. How important was Essence Magazine for the development of Black women writers? Just in my own personal life, the first time I ever recalled seeing Audre Lorde's name, right, and reading anything from her, was in a copy of my mother's Essence magazine when she sat down with James Baldwin. Yes, right. I mean, you and at least thousands of other readers. I mean, not in the least, by the way, in that case, although it was largely excised from Essence, Peace, and Revolutionary Love, for Baldwin and Lorde, their kind of queer politics and queer lives, even just to have them included in the pages of Essence as a mass market Black magazine is radical in those terms. So Essence is hugely important. I will say that firstly, Marcia Gillespie, when she was at Essence in 76, was willing to take on and feature For Colored Girls when Miss Magazine wasn't. I think it was Patricia Spears Jones, may have been Margo Jefferson, who told me that Gillespie was like, hold up, let's pause everything, and stopped an issue and put For Color Girls, this is in 76, November 76, I think, on the cover of Essence, did a multi-page, spread with photographs, a little interview with Shange, talking to some of the actors,
big feature. Now, that makes sense because it's a major performance that's on Broadway in New York.
Right.
Otherwise, it was women of the Sisterhood and their broader network who pushed hard on Essence to make it not just a beauty and lifestyle magazine, but an outlet for serious Black feminist thought. And just like your question about Seek, this is all happening within the confines of an institution, right? So it's both and. So, you know, first with Marsha Gillespie, and then and Susan Taylor, who also attended Sisterhood meetings, and then Cheryl Y. Green. And I really knew nothing about Cheryl Y. Green going into this project. Who was a major editor at Essence, held many different roles from the 70s, at least to the 80s at Essence. But it was Alexis Gumbs, who had written, first of all, the only published thing on Cheryl Green, which was a scholarly obituary in Soul's journal. But it was Alexis who gathered Cheryl Y. Green's archive after her passing and housed it at Emory and tipped me off to the fact that it was there, uncatalogued, you know, but that I could learn about that Cheryl Green is one of these people that, like Toni Cade Bambara, had her hands and her eyes on everybody's writing in this period. So the Sisterhood, in collaboration with Marsha Gillespie and Cheryl Green, pushes Essence to become more feminist, more political, and at least with an undercurrent of kind of a queer liberation too, even if we don't always see it. So in other words, I don't know what piece you saw by Audre Lorde in your mother's copy of Essence, but it could have been about Grenada, or it could have been June Jordan writing about Nicaragua, which is unimaginable in an earlier stage of Essence, that Black American women's expertise on foreign policy would be a centerpiece of writing in Essence.
The elephant in the room for the Sisterhood and in the book is Michelle Wallace's Black Macho, The Myth of the Superwoman. You know, there is celebratory responses to When Colored Girls comes out, even though it is being attacked by Black men as being anti-Black, right? Very often misogynistic narratives coming from folks like Ishmael Reed, who was fairly consistent in those years in that regard. You know, Michelle Wallace's The Black Macho appears 2 years later, and the women within the Sisterhood are also conflicted about not so much the arguments as you write in Wallace's book, but the way that the book seemed to take over the whole conversation about Black women writers and Black feminist thought.
That's right. So the Sisterhood is kind of bookended by backlash to For Colored Girls right before it starts meeting, and backlash to Black Macho right after, as the meetings end. It was, as any of these women, you know, I mean, Toni Morrison says this thing about, I wish the market would bear 5 Toni Morrisons at once. And that's her speaking as an editor, right? But Morrison understands that she's the Black woman novelist for that period of time. Michelle Wallace has always been keenly attuned to the problem of the one spectacular example, or the sort of discourses of exceptionalism. Wallace has always been highly attuned to that. So I think that when there was some dissent within the Sisterhood about Black Macho and the myth of the Superwoman, it was around, you know, June Jordan is doing lots of nonfiction writing, and she's collaborating on a piece about Sojourner Truth, and she doesn't understand why that wouldn't also be getting some of that attention. I mean, it also is the fact that, and again, this is not really about Michelle Wallace or about the words in Black Macho, but about its space in the culture. So when Miss Magazine decides to put Michelle Wallace on the cover and run an excerpt of the book, in the context of the already complicated history of, Alice Walker having a tense relationship with Miss over the years, and arguing over how, wanting to see more and more political work by Black women in the magazine, that Michelle Wallace is the place that Miss gives the space to, actually also only amplifies the dynamic where a white readership or viewership, feminist or otherwise, has a seemingly boundless appetite for an exaggerated idea of intra-racial conflict between Black men and Black women.
Right, and this was part of Ishmael Reed's critique, right? So on some level, they were actually agreeing with each other around that part of the critique.
I mean, these women agreed with Ishmael Reed about any variety of things, and all really liked him, even when he was given a hard time. So there's some interesting dynamics there too. Yeah.
When all was said and done, Professor Thorsson, why was the sisterhood so important? Why is it important for us to look back at those 2 years and the ripples and impact that they have had since then? Why is it important for us to know this story now?
The sisterhood and the concurrent generation of Black feminist scholars, so I'm talking Mary Helen Washington, Trudeau Harris, Claudia Tate, Nellie McKay, and so on, along with and alongside the writers and intellectuals in the sisterhood, made possible the field of African American literary studies, made Black feminist thought central to literary studies and history and women's studies departments. They provided a roadmap for how to collaborate, even with dissent and conflict happening in the group. And for me, even though they only met regularly for 2 years, we are just beginning to understand the effects. When you say ripples, I mean, for me, it's waves. Like, the sisterhood isn't even over yet. I mean, the idea that members like Margo Jefferson have in some ways had their greatest visibility many years on, and they still understand that is completely connected to the collaborative work that was happening in the sisterhood. I mean, so that's one reason we need to grapple with it. But the most important thing for readers to take away from the sisterhood, and I think based on what I'm hearing from my students who've had a peek at the book at the University of Oregon, I think this is happening, which is for young people now to reimagine those what Robin Kelley would call freedom dreams, in Robin Kelley's terms, those ideas about what's possible. Sisterhood members had come up in a time when they thought free college tuition for everyone was coming down the pike. Free healthcare for children under 5 everywhere. A real social safety net, like access to a basic sustainable life that allows you to create art and contribute in ways that are not only about like participation in a capitalist marketplace. They believed all that was inevitable. And I don't know about you, but my students now my college students have never been alive at a time when those possibilities were part of the regular discourse. Yeah. So it increasingly seems to me to like make those possibilities just part of normal, everyday, radical freedom imagination among young people. That's what I'd like them to take from this.
Farah Jasmine Griffin says of the sisterhood, this is a profoundly important study, and it is found in an astute and sensitive author in Courtney Thorsson. Professor Thorsson, thank you for joining us this afternoon to talk about your wonderful new book, The Sisterhood, How a Network of Black Women Writers Changed American Culture, published by Columbia University Press.
A pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black